The jungle was alive with the sound of insects and distant birds when Private Kenji Watanabe first heard it, that terrible mechanical roar that would haunt his dreams for years to come. It was late afternoon in December 1942, and the thick undergrowth of Guadalcanal seemed to press in from all sides, the air so humid that every breath felt like drinking warm water. Watanabe had been crawling for what felt like hours, his Type 38 rifle clutched so tightly against his chest that his knuckles had gone white, sweat not just pouring but streaming down his back in rivulets that soaked through his uniform until the fabric clung to his skin like a second layer. His squad, 12 men who had trained together back in Hiroshima before shipping out to this green hell, had received their orders just after the morning rice ration, such as it was, barely enough to fill a man's palm. They were to advance through the jungle, locate an American position that intelligence suggested was holding the ridge line above the Matanico River, and silence it before nightfall. The briefing had been short, almost dismissive in its confidence. Perhaps a handful of American soldiers, their lieutenant had said with the certainty of a man who had never faced what was waiting up there. Perhaps some rifles, maybe a light machine gun if they were unlucky, nothing that disciplined Japanese soldiers couldn't overcome with speed and determination. What they encountered instead, what rose up from that ridgeline like the voice of some terrible industrial god, was something none of them had imagined in their worst nightmares. The sound began as a distant rumble, and for a heartbeat Watanabe thought perhaps it was artillery, some distant bombardment from ships offshore. But then the noise resolved itself into something continuous, something that didn't boom and fade but sustained itself with mechanical precision, a steady thunderous roar that seemed to fill the entire world. It wasn't the sharp crack of rifle fire or even the staccato bursts of the light machine guns he knew, the Type 96 that their own heavy weapons squad carried. This was different, fundamentally different, streams of fire so thick and continuous that they seemed to physically stitch the jungle together, creating visible lines of destruction through the green canopy. Branches didn't just snap, they disintegrated, exploding into splinters that became projectiles themselves. The earth itself seemed to erupt wherever those streams of fire touched down, geysers of dirt and shredded vegetation fountaining upward. And men, his squad mates, soldiers he had eaten with and marched beside for months, they fell screaming, or sometimes without making any sound at all, simply crumpling as if invisible hands had reached down and switched them off. Watanabe pressed himself flat against the ground, his face buried in rotting leaves and mud, his entire body shaking not from fear alone, but from the sheer physical vibration of rounds impacting the earth around him. Through gaps in the undergrowth, he could see the ridgeline now, and what he saw made no sense to his understanding of warfare. The Americans weren't firing in bursts, conserving ammunition the way any sensible soldier would. They were simply holding down their triggers, or so it seemed, letting their weapons roar continuously, without pause, without mercy, without any sign that they would ever stop. How can they fire so long without stopping? Watanabe thought, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. How can they have so many bullets? The Type 96 his squad carried could fire perhaps 50 rounds before the barrel grew too hot, before the mechanism began to seize up, before the gunner had to pause and let the weapon cool. But these American guns, they just kept going, on, and the sound of them burrowed into his skull and made thinking almost impossible. This was Watanabe's first real encounter with the weapon that would come to symbolize, more than any tank or aircraft or artillery piece, the sheer industrial might that America could bring to bear on the battlefield. The heavy machine gun, and specifically the weapons that John Moses Browning had designed decades earlier, guns that had been perfected and refined until they achieved a kind of mechanical immortality, a reliability so profound that soldiers on both sides spoke of them with something approaching religious awe. The US Army and Marine Corps fielded primarily two variants in the Pacific Theater, and Japanese soldiers would learn to distinguish them by sound, by the particular rhythm of death each one produced. First was the Browning M 1917, a water-cooled beast chambered in 30-06 Springfield, a rifle cartridge that was already formidable in a single-shot weapon, but became something altogether different when fired at rates exceeding 450 rounds per minute. The water cooling system, a brass jacket surrounding the barrel that could hold several quarts of liquid, allowed the gun to sustain fire for hours, literally hours, as long as ammunition continued to feed into the mechanism and water remained in the jacket. Then there was the bigger weapon, the one that Japanese soldiers learned to fear above all others, the Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun. Mar-Deuce, the Americans called it, a nickname that seemed almost affectionate, as if they were talking about a beloved aunt rather than a weapon that fired half-inch bullets at velocities approaching 3,000 feet per second. Each round carried enough kinetic energy to tear through not just human flesh, but engine blocks, concrete walls, and even the armor plating on light tanks. When an M2 opened fire, it didn't just kill men, it obliterated cover, eliminated any sense of safety, reduced supposed positions of strength into death traps. Palm trees that were 2 feet thick at the base simply exploded when 50 caliber rounds struck them, the wood splintering outward in clouds of deadly fragments. Stone walls that had stood for decades cracked and crumbled. Caves that seemed like natural fortresses collapsed inward as sustained fire weakened the rock itself. Japanese soldiers who thought they had found sanctuary discovered there was nowhere, absolutely nowhere, that could protect them from this weapon. The psychological impact of facing these guns went far beyond their obvious physical lethality. Japanese military doctrine, the very foundation on which their entire army was built, emphasized certain virtues above all others: courage in the face of death, willingness to close with the enemy, the supremacy of spirit over material, the mystical power of the bayonet charge when executed by men who had accepted that they were already dead. These weren't just tactical principles, they were spiritual beliefs, woven into the fabric of what it meant to be a soldier of the Emperor. Training had been brutal, designed to strip away any sense of self-preservation and replace it with absolute obedience and the conviction that dying gloriously in battle was the highest achievement possible for a Japanese man. And in China, these tactics had worked, had overwhelmed defensive positions and broken Chinese armies despite their sometimes superior numbers. But machine guns, particularly the American heavy machine guns, simply robbed these tactics of any power they might have had. What use was courage when you couldn't even see the enemy before you died? What good was determination to close with the opponent when 50 caliber rounds were tearing your body apart from distances exceeding a mile? How could spirit overcome material when the material was arriving in such overwhelming quantities? At Guadalcanal, which would become the proving ground for so many terrible lessons learned on both sides, Japanese commanders initially refused to believe the reports coming back from the few survivors of early engagements. They launched attack after attack, particularly at night when they believed darkness would shield them from American firepower and allow them to leverage their supposed superiority in close combat. Night after night, columns of shouting men, hundreds strong, would surge forward toward American positions, their officers leading from the front with drawn swords, soldiers with fixed bayonets believing that their fighting spirit would carry them through whatever resistance they encountered. The Marines, when they first faced these banzai charges, were genuinely shaken. The sheer audacity of it, the willingness of human beings to run directly into machine gun fire while screaming at the top of their lungs, was outside their experience and expectations. Some Marines broke and ran in those first encounters, unable to process what they were seeing. But then the Browning machine guns opened up, and everything changed. The sound alone was enough to unnerve anyone. When multiple heavy machine guns fired simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of fire with their streams of tracer rounds visible in the darkness like burning lines drawn across the night, the noise was absolutely overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to push against the chest and make the air itself vibrate. But it was what those guns did to attacking forces that truly defied belief. Whole battalions, 600 men or more, vanished in minutes, not in the sense that they retreated or broke formation, but literally ceased to exist as organized military units. Bodies piled up in windows so thick that following waves of attackers had to climb over corpses to continue the advance, and those men died just as quickly, adding to the growing walls of dead. One Marine officer, writing home after weeks of these nocturnal slaughters, described it with terrible simplicity. "It was like mowing grass," he wrote, and you could hear in those words both horror at what he had witnessed and relief that his machine guns made survival possible. The Japanese simply could not or would not accept that their tactics were obsolete, that courage and determination were meaningless variables in an equation that came down to industrial capacity and rate of fire. Japanese survivors, the handful who lived through these charges and made it back to their own lines, could not comprehend, literally could not fit into their understanding of warfare, how Americans could pour fire without pause, feeding belt after belt after belt into their weapons until hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of rounds had been expended and still the guns kept firing. Watanabe, after his own narrow escape during that first contact, spoke with other survivors when his depleted squad finally regrouped days later in a defensive position miles from the ridge. Each man told the same story with minor variations. The American guns never stopped, never seemed to overheat, never jammed at crucial moments. One corporal, who had been a factory worker in Osaka before the war, tried to explain it in terms the others could understand. "Their machine guns," he said, "are like the machines in a textile mill back home. They are designed to run continuously, all day, every day, with minimal maintenance. Our weapons are more like something a craftsman would make in his workshop, beautiful and effective in skilled hands, but not meant for mass production or sustained use." The comparison was apt, but brought no comfort. Japan simply did not have the industrial base to produce weapons of such quality in the quantities needed, and even if they had, their logistics system could not have delivered the ammunition required to feed them. This brings us to one of the lesser-known but absolutely critical factors in American machine gun dominance, the logistics tail that made continuous fire possible. Machine guns are, by their very nature, extraordinarily hungry weapons. A single Browning M 1917 firing at a modest rate could consume 1,000 rounds in just over 2 minutes. In a sustained defensive action lasting hours, one gun might fire 20,000 rounds or more. Multiply that by the dozens or hundreds of machine guns that might be deployed in a major battle, and the ammunition requirements become staggering, measured not in thousands but in millions of rounds. Yet American supply lines, even in the early desperate days on Guadalcanal when food was scarce and medicine scarcer, somehow continued to deliver crate after crate of ammunition. Ships dodged submarine patrols and aerial attacks to make the run to the island. Work parties unloaded under fire. Supplies were cached and distributed even as Japanese artillery tried to destroy the dumps. Marines, half-starved and suffering from dysentery and malaria, would joke darkly that they had more bullets than beans, and this wasn't far from the truth. The priority placed on ammunition delivery, particularly for crew-served weapons like machine guns, revealed a fundamental understanding of modern warfare that Japanese logistics never quite grasped. Japanese soldiers, by terrible contrast, often found themselves desperately rationing ammunition from almost the moment they entered combat. 5 rounds per man was sometimes the allocation, occasionally less than that. Their machine guns, the Type 96 and later the Type 99 light machine guns that were supposed to provide squad-level automatic fire, would sputter through their 30-round box magazines in a handful of bursts, then fall silent as gunners waited for ammunition that never came or came too late. The psychological effect of this disparity cannot be overstated. Imagine being a soldier who has been trained to believe in the superiority of your cause and your forces, only to discover that the enemy not only has better weapons, but seemingly infinite ammunition to feed into those weapons, while you are counting every bullet. The sense of abandonment, of being outmatched not by better soldiers but by better factories and supply chains, was devastating to morale. Japanese soldiers began to understand, gradually and with growing despair, that they were not fighting American courage or American tactics. They were fighting American industry, and American industry was something they could neither defeat nor even meaningfully resist. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 provided another horrifying demonstration of what American heavy machine guns could accomplish when properly employed and supplied. The Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying Betio, the main islet of Tarawa Atoll, creating a network of bunkers and defensive positions that they believed made the place impregnable. Their own machine guns were carefully sighted to create overlapping fields of fire across the beaches and lagoon. They had artillery, they had extensive barbed wire obstacles, they had mines, and they had nearly 5,000 determined men who had sworn to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, reportedly told his officers that the Americans could not take Tarawa with 1,000,000 men in 100 years. He was wrong. The battle lasted 76 hours, and while the cost in marine casualties was indeed horrific, the defenders were virtually annihilated. And once again, Browning heavy machine guns played a decisive role in breaking Japanese resistance. When the first waves of Marines approached the beaches in their landing craft and amphibious tractors, they were met with everything the Japanese could throw at them. Artillery shells burst in the water, mortar rounds walked across the lagoon, machine gun fire raked the thin-skinned vehicles. Men died before they ever reached the coral reef. But the Americans, learning from previous amphibious assaults, had mounted Browning heavy machine guns, both water-cooled M1917 and the bigger M250 caliber weapons, on their amphibious tractors and even on some of the larger landing craft. These guns began returning fire even as they advanced through the surf, pouring streams of bullets toward Japanese positions. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Japanese machine gun nests that revealed themselves by firing found their positions bracketed by return fire so heavy that the guns went silent, either because the crews were killed or because they were forced to take cover. Bunker embrasures that seemed impregnable became death traps when 50 caliber rounds began punching through them. Defenders who had thought themselves safely concealed behind coconut log barriers watched in disbelief as American fire literally disintegrated their cover, reducing sturdy palm trunks to splinters and shredded fiber. Japanese survivors of Tarawa, and there were pitifully few of them, fewer than 100 out of nearly 5,000 defenders, reported a sense of complete disorientation during the battle. They had expected rifle fire from the Marines once they established beachheads. They had expected grenades and flamethrowers as Americans cleared bunkers. What they had not anticipated was the sheer volume of automatic weapons fire that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. A single amphibious tractor, they reported, could unleash more fire than an entire platoon of riflemen, and there were dozens of these vehicles. When Marines did establish their first foothold on the beach, one of the immediate priorities was setting up water-cooled Browning machine guns, always in pairs or larger groups, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned approaches into killing zones. Japanese counterattacks, launched with typical courage and desperation, died before they reached the surf line, men falling in heaps as machine guns traversed back and forth with mechanical precision. The 50 caliber M2 achieved an almost legendary status among both sides for its devastating effectiveness. This weapon, which had been designed in the 1920s specifically to give infantry a man-portable weapon capable of engaging aircraft and light armor, proved extraordinarily versatile in the Pacific. Mounted on tripods for ground use, it could reach out to ranges exceeding 2,000 yards with accuracy, far beyond what any infantryman with a rifle could achieve. The massive cartridge it fired, essentially a scaled-up version of the 30-06 with even more powder behind an even heavier bullet, delivered energy on target that was genuinely difficult to comprehend without seeing the results firsthand. When an M2 round struck a human body, the results were catastrophic, often literally disintegrating limbs or torsos. When those same rounds struck equipment or fortifications, they punched through with terrifying ease. Sandbag barriers that would stop rifle fire were penetrated as if they didn't exist. Concrete walls up to several inches thick cracked under sustained 50 caliber fire. Light armor, the kind found on reconnaissance vehicles or armored cars, was simply perforated. And because the M2 could sustain fire for extended periods, gunners could literally chew through fortifications, methodically destroying bunkers and pillboxes by targeting the same spot repeatedly until structural failure occurred. When the M2 was mounted on aircraft, which happened extensively throughout the Pacific, it became even more terrifying for Japanese ground forces. American fighters like the P-40 Warhawk, the F-4U Corsair, and the P-38 Lightning typically carried multiple 50-caliber machine guns, sometimes as many as 6 or 8 weapons firing simultaneously. When these aircraft made strafing runs on Japanese positions, the effect was apocalyptic. Each pass might last only a few seconds, but in that time thousands of rounds would tear through whatever target the pilot had selected. Bunkers that had survived artillery bombardment collapsed under aerial machine gun fire. Trenches became graves as rounds plunged in from above. Supply dumps exploded when tracer rounds ignited fuel or ammunition. Even tanks, the handful that Japan deployed to Pacific battlefields, proved vulnerable to concentrated 50-caliber fire from aircraft, with rounds penetrating thinner top armor or disabling treads and external equipment. Japanese soldiers on islands like Bougainville and New Britain described watching helplessly as American aircraft circled above them, seemingly at leisure, selecting targets and destroying them one by one with machine gun fire alone, no bombs required. The psychological effect of this air superiority, knowing that death could arrive from above at any moment delivered by guns that seemed to have unlimited ammunition, contributed to the growing sense of hopelessness that infected Japanese forces as the war ground on. The battle for Iwo Jima in early 1945 represented perhaps the ultimate demonstration of American firepower, and specifically heavy machine gun dominance. The Japanese defenders, more than 20,000 men, had spent months creating what they believed was an impregnable fortress, a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers carved into the volcanic rock, mutually supporting positions that could theoretically hold out for months against even overwhelming force. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had studied American tactics extensively and specifically ordered his men to avoid wasteful banzai charges. Instead, they would fight from prepared positions, inflicting maximum casualties before being overwhelmed. His strategy worked in the sense that American casualties on Iwo Jima were indeed horrific. Nearly 27,000 Marines killed or wounded, taking an island barely 8 square miles in size. But the outcome was never in doubt, not after the first hours of the battle when it became clear that the Americans had brought to bear firepower on a scale that made defense, no matter how determined, ultimately futile. Browning heavy machine guns lined every ridge the Marines secured. They were positioned on the beaches to provide covering fire for follow-on waves. They were mounted on tanks that crawled forward through the black volcanic sand, sweeping positions with arcs of fire that cut down any Japanese soldier who dared expose himself. They were even positioned on ships offshore, providing suppressive fire for advancing infantry. Marines carried lighter machine guns forward with them, the air-cooled M1919 Browning that could be moved by a 2-man team, and these weapons were set up every few dozen yards, creating such a density of automatic fire that movement across open ground became suicidal for defenders. When Marines encountered cave mouths, frequent on that hellish island, the response was often to bring up a 50-caliber machine gun and simply pour fire into the opening, thousands of rounds ricocheting through the interior until anything living inside was shredded or driven deeper into the rock. The sound of it, as one survivor described, was like being inside a bell that was continuously struck, the noise so overwhelming that men went deaf, temporarily or permanently, and the constant vibration made teeth rattle and vision blur. Japanese survivors of Iwo Jima, and there were fewer than 200 out of more than 20,000 defenders, spoke in interviews after the war about the complete hopelessness of trying to resist such overwhelming firepower. "Everywhere there is the sound of the big gun," one former sergeant said through a translator, his hands still trembling years after the battle. "We cannot move in daylight because the guns will find us. We cannot move at night because the Americans have lights and the guns fire anyway. We cannot stand because the bullets cut us down. We cannot stay hidden because they destroy our caves with the big guns. We cannot live. This last statement, delivered flatly without emotion, captured the essential reality of late-war Pacific combat. Japanese forces, cut off from resupply, low on ammunition and food, facing an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources, were not fighting battles in any traditional sense. They were being systematically exterminated by industrial processes that happened to involve bullets rather than other methods. Another aspect of American heavy machine gun employment that shocked Japanese forces was the complete integration of these weapons into every level of the military structure. In a Japanese infantry squad, typically 13 men, there would be one light machine gun, usually a Type 96 or Type 99, and this weapon was the centerpiece of the squad's tactics. Everything revolved around supporting the machine gun and its two-man crew. Riflemen existed primarily to carry ammunition for the gun and protect it from enemy assault. In contrast, American doctrine distributed firepower much more evenly. An American rifle squad had its own organic automatic weapon, usually a Browning automatic rifle, which, while not a true machine gun, provided significant automatic fire capability. At the platoon level, there would be a dedicated machine gun section, often with 2 or 3 guns. At the company level, there would be a heavy weapons platoon with more machine guns and often mortars as well. This meant that an American infantry unit could generate sustained automatic fire from multiple positions simultaneously, creating layered and overlapping fields of fire that were extraordinarily difficult to assault through. Japanese attackers who maneuvered to avoid or suppress one machine gun position often found themselves running directly into fire from 2 or 3 more guns they hadn't even known were there. The training American machine gunners received also contributed significantly to their effectiveness. Before deploying overseas, gunners would fire thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of practice rounds, becoming intimately familiar with their weapons and developing the muscle memory necessary to clear jams quickly, change barrels when necessary, and maintain effective fire under stress. They learned to fire in traversing patterns that covered maximum area with minimum ammunition expenditure, though ammunition was rarely a concern. They practiced indirect fire techniques, lobbing bullets over obstacles to hit targets they couldn't see directly. They learned to identify target priorities, understanding when to focus fire on enemy weapons crews and when to engage massed infantry. Most importantly, they learned to trust their weapons absolutely, to have complete confidence that if they did their part, the machine gun would never let them down. Japanese machine gunners, by contrast, often received minimal training due to ammunition shortages. Many never fired live rounds during training, instead going through dry fire exercises while instructors made bang noises to simulate firing. When these poorly trained crews encountered combat, they often found themselves uncertain and hesitant, which in machine gun combat was a death sentence. The industrial arithmetic behind machine gun production tells a story that is almost as dramatic as the combat accounts. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the United States had produced approximately 2.5 million Browning machine guns of all types. This includes M1917S, M1919S, M2s, and various other variants. The production was distributed across multiple factories, with companies like Colt, Remington, and General Motors creating dedicated production lines that churned out these weapons with assembly line efficiency. Quality control was rigorous. Each weapon was test-fired before acceptance, ensuring that what reached the front lines would perform reliably. Japan, meanwhile, managed to produce fewer than 100,000 light machine guns during the entire war and only a tiny fraction of heavy machine guns comparable to the M2. The disparity wasn't just in numbers, but in quality. American weapons benefited from precision manufacturing using advanced machine tools and quality steel alloys. Japanese weapons, particularly those produced late in the war, often suffered from material shortages and declining manufacturing standards as Allied bombing and submarine warfare disrupted supply chains. This massive production advantage meant that American forces could afford to be profligate with their heavy weapons. If a machine gun was damaged or worn out, another was available to replace it almost immediately. Spare barrels were common, spare parts abundant. Armories could supply entire battalions with new weapons if necessary. Japanese forces had no such luxury. A machine gun lost in combat often could not be replaced. Spare parts were non-existent or had to be fabricated by hand. Damaged weapons had to be cannibalized to keep other weapons functioning. As the war progressed and Japan's industrial capacity degraded under Allied bombardment and blockade, even basic maintenance became difficult. Replacement barrels, springs, firing pins, all the small components that allowed machine guns to function, became precious commodities hoarded by unit armories. The psychological dimension of facing American heavy machine guns deserves deeper examination because the impact went far beyond physical casualties. For soldiers raised in a military culture that emphasized spirit and willpower, that taught them from their first days in training that determination could overcome material disadvantages, the encounter with weapons that made spirit irrelevant was profoundly demoralizing. Japanese military philosophy, influenced by samurai traditions and modified for modern industrial warfare, held that the Japanese soldier, properly motivated and led, was superior to any Western soldier. The Chinese campaigns seemed to confirm this, victory after victory, often against numerically superior forces. But then came the Pacific War and American machine guns, and suddenly all those philosophical principles seemed like lies designed to console the weak. Courage was useless when you died before even seeing the enemy. Determination achieved nothing when bullets cut you down in seconds. The vaunted Japanese spirit, which commanders invoked endlessly in their orders and speeches, could not stop a single .50 caliber round from tearing a man in half. Interviews with Japanese prisoners of war, conducted throughout the Pacific by American intelligence officers, revealed this psychological devastation repeatedly. Men who had been captured, often seriously wounded, after surviving battles where most of their comrades died, spoke with something approaching wonder about American firepower. One soldier captured on Peleliu, when asked why Japanese forces had been defeated, simply said that courage was useless against such weapons. He had charged American lines 3 times, he explained, and each time everyone around him had fallen. He himself had been hit twice, once in the leg and once in the shoulder, but had somehow survived where hundreds hadn't. "We charged bravely," he told his interrogators, "but the Americans had guns that never stopped. It was as if they had more bullets than we had men." This haunting statement, "it was as if they had more bullets than we had men," appeared in interrogation reports from across the Pacific theater, different men using almost identical words to describe their experience, suggesting a universal truth that Japanese soldiers had discovered: American industrial capacity translated directly into battlefield lethality, and there was simply no answer to it. Prisoners captured after the battle for Okinawa, the last and bloodiest ground campaign of the Pacific War, repeated variations on the same theme. "Their fire never ends," they would say, sometimes with resignation, sometimes with something approaching respect. The defensive positions on Okinawa had been even more elaborate than Iwo Jima: natural cave systems augmented by artificial tunnels, heavy artillery zeroed in on likely approach routes, months of preparation creating what Japanese commanders believed was an impregnable defense. They were wrong. American forces, by this point veterans of years of island-hopping campaigns, had refined their tactics to a brutal science. When they encountered resistance, they brought overwhelming firepower to bear. Heavy machine guns, flamethrowers, artillery, naval gunfire, tactical air support, all coordinated to eliminate defenders with maximum efficiency and minimum American casualties. The ratio of Japanese to American deaths on Okinawa told the story clearly: roughly 100,000 Japanese military dead versus about 12,000 Americans killed, a ratio that reflected not greater American courage, but better weapons, better logistics, and better integration of firepower. For American troops, and this perspective is equally important to understand, the Browning heavy machine gun became more than just a weapon. It was a lifeline, a source of comfort, a mechanical guardian angel that stood between them and death. Marines pinned down by Japanese snipers, unable to move without drawing fire, would call for heavy machine guns to be brought forward. The procedure was well rehearsed. Gunners would set up, acquire the approximate location of the sniper based on where fire was coming from, and then simply saturate the area with hundreds or thousands of rounds, splintering trees and shredding vegetation until either the sniper was hit or forced to relocate. Soldiers advancing against bunkers would take cover and wait for a machine gun crew to move up and engage the position, watching as tracer rounds walked across the bunker face and then concentrated on the firing port until the fortification went silent. There was something almost hypnotic about watching a skilled machine gun crew work, the way they moved with practiced efficiency, loading belts and making fine adjustments to their aim, the way the weapon itself seemed to become an extension of their will. Many veterans, writing memoirs decades after the war ended, credited their survival specifically to the supporting fire provided by heavy machine guns. When you heard Mar-Deuce firing, one former Marine wrote, you felt like nothing could get through, and that psychological effect was almost as important as the physical protection the weapon provided. In the chaos and terror of combat, particularly jungle combat where visibility was measured in yards and any bush might conceal an enemy soldier, the steady thunder of a friendly heavy machine gun provided orientation and reassurance. You knew where your own lines were, you knew someone was watching your back, you knew that if the Japanese tried to overrun your position, they would have to go through that wall of lead first. This confidence allowed American troops to function effectively even under tremendous stress, to advance when fear screamed at them to take cover, to hold positions when instinct urged retreat. The mechanical reliability of Browning's designs contributed significantly to this confidence. Soldiers knew, based on training and combat experience, that their machine guns would function when needed. The M1917 water-cooled gun could fire for hours without jamming if properly maintained and supplied with ammunition. The M2050 caliber was even more robust, built with such massive tolerances and over-engineered components that it was almost impossible to break under field conditions. Stories circulated among troops about machine guns that had fired tens of thousands of rounds without cleaning and still functioned perfectly, about weapons pulled from crashed aircraft or sunken ships that fired without issue after minimal maintenance, about Mar-Deuce in particular being essentially indestructible. Whether all these stories were literally true matters, less than the fact that soldiers believed them, and that belief translated into tactical confidence. A machine gun crew that trusts their weapon absolutely will employ it more aggressively and effectively than one that worries about malfunctions. Japanese weapons, unfortunately for their users, did not inspire the same confidence. The Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, while reasonably well-designed weapons when properly manufactured and maintained, had several inherent weaknesses that became critical in combat. The top-mounted magazine, holding only 30 rounds, meant that a gunner could empty his weapon in just a few seconds of sustained fire. Changing magazines under fire was difficult and exposed the gunner to return fire. The cooling system, which relied on airflow around the barrel rather than water cooling, meant that sustained fire would cause the barrel to overheat quickly, warping it and potentially causing dangerous malfunctions. The optical sights, while theoretically more precise than the iron sights on American weapons, were also more fragile and prone to damage from rough handling or impacts. Most critically, the weapons required high-quality ammunition to function reliably, and as the war progressed and Japanese manufacturing standards declined, ammunition quality degraded to the point where jams became frequent. A machine gun that jams every few dozen rounds is worse than useless. It's a death trap that provides the enemy with a clear target without providing effective suppressive fire in return. The contrast in logistics support amplified all these inherent differences between American and Japanese machine guns. An American machine gun crew in the field could expect regular resupply of ammunition, sometimes multiple times per day during intense combat. They could expect replacement barrels when the current one showed wear. They could expect cleaning supplies, spare parts, even replacement weapons if necessary. This logistical support meant that weapons could be maintained in peak condition and employed without concern for ammunition expenditure. Japanese machine gun crews had no such support. Ammunition arrived irregularly, if at all. Replacement barrels didn't exist for most units. Spare parts had to be fabricated or scavenged. As the American submarine blockade tightened and supply ships stopped reaching forward positions, Japanese units found themselves with weapons they couldn't feed or maintain. Some Type 96 guns were abandoned, not because they were damaged, but because there was simply no ammunition available for them. Others were kept in reserve, hoarded by commanders who refused to commit them to combat because once the limited ammunition was expended, the gun became just dead weight. The tactical employment of machine guns by American forces evolved significantly as the Pacific War progressed, driven by hard lessons learned in early campaigns. At Guadalcanal, machine guns were often positioned reactively, setting up hasty defensive positions when Japanese attacks developed. This worked. The guns still devastated attacking forces, but it was inefficient and sometimes allowed Japanese troops to get closer than necessary before fire could be brought to bear effectively. By Tarawa and subsequent operations, American doctrine had evolved to emphasize pre-planned fields of fire, with machine gun positions selected during planning phases to create interlocking fire that covered all likely approaches. Gunners knew exactly where to aim before any enemy appeared, and when attacks developed, they simply executed their pre-planned fire missions. This turned machine gun defense from reactive to proactive, creating killing zones that existed independent of where attackers actually appeared. The integration of machine guns with other weapons systems also improved dramatically. Early in the war, machine guns often fired independently, with little coordination with adjacent units or supporting arms. By mid-war, American forces had developed sophisticated fire plans where machine guns, mortars, artillery, and even close air support worked in coordination, each element supporting the others. A typical defensive fire plan might designate primary and secondary fields of fire for each machine gun, identify likely enemy approach routes, and pre-register mortar and artillery concentrations on those routes. When an attack developed, machine guns would engage first, forcing attackers to bunch up or go to ground. Then mortars and artillery would strike the now stationary targets. If attackers withdrew, machine guns would pursue them with fire. If they continued advancing, machine guns would maintain fire until attackers were so close that friendly forces had to cease fire to avoid hitting their own people, at which point grenades and rifles took over. This kind of integrated fire planning, with machine guns as a central component, maximized the effectiveness of all weapons and made attacking American positions extraordinarily costly. Japanese forces attempted to adapt to American machine gun dominance with varying degrees of success. Some units developed tactics for approaching machine gun positions under cover of darkness or heavy vegetation, using terrain to mask their advance until they were close enough to assault with grenades and explosives. These tactics sometimes worked, particularly early in the war when American units were still learning their craft, but they required favorable terrain and often resulted in heavy casualties even when successful. Other units tried to suppress American machine guns with their own fire, using their limited machine guns and rifles to force American gunners to take cover while assault teams advanced. Again, this occasionally worked, but it required a level of fire coordination and ammunition expenditure that most Japanese units couldn't sustain. The most common adaptation was simply to accept that attacking American positions would be costly and try to make those costs as worthwhile as possible, accepting casualties as inevitable and focusing on inflicting maximum damage before being destroyed. This was a grim calculus, but perhaps the only realistic response to a situation where tactical victory was impossible. As the war moved into its final year, American machine gun superiority had become so overwhelming that it influenced strategic decisions. Japanese commanders planning the defense of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the home islands knew they could not win in any conventional sense. Instead, they designed their defenses to maximize American casualties, hoping to make the cost of victory so high that the Allies would negotiate a settlement rather than invading Japan proper. Central to these defensive plans was avoiding direct engagements where American firepower superiority would be decisive, instead using fortifications and prepared positions to create close-quarters combat where individual Japanese soldiers might achieve better exchange ratios. Even these plans acknowledged implicitly that American machine guns made open battle suicidal. The best Japanese forces could hope for was to force Americans to dig them out of fortifications yard by yard, making them pay for every position. The moral and ethical dimensions of this firepower dominance deserve acknowledgement. American machine gunners were killing enemy soldiers who often had no realistic chance of fighting back effectively, mowing down attackers at ranges where Japanese weapons couldn't even reach American positions. Some gunners struggled with this after the war, describing the experience not as battle but as execution, pulling a trigger and watching human beings fall in rows. Others rationalized it as necessary, pointing out that every Japanese soldier they killed from distance was one less enemy who might kill American soldiers in close combat. The truth, as with most aspects of war, was complicated and uncomfortable. American machine guns did save American lives by destroying enemy forces at distance, but they also created killing on a scale that was sometimes difficult to process psychologically, even for those doing the killing. For Private Kenji Watanabe, that first encounter with American heavy machine guns on Guadalcanal defined everything that came after. He survived that terrible afternoon, crawling deeper into jungle shadows, while the rhythmic thunder of Browning guns continued behind him, somehow making his way back to Japanese lines, though he never understood quite how. His squad, those 12 men he had trained with back in Hiroshima, were gone, all dead in those first few minutes when the American guns opened up. Watanabe would fight on Guadalcanal for another month before his unit was evacuated in the face of growing American strength, then fight again on New Georgia and Bougainville, always retreating, always outgunned, watching the empire he had been told was invincible crumble under the weight of American steel and lead. He was wounded twice, once by shell fragments and once by a bullet that passed through his left arm without hitting bone, extraordinarily lucky wounds that required only basic treatment and let him return to duty. He surrendered finally on Bougainville in late 1944, part of a group of starving soldiers who had been cut off from their units and supplies for weeks, living on roots and insects, too weak to fight any longer. American interrogators found him cooperative, willing to answer questions about Japanese tactics and weapons, though he knew little of strategic value, having been just a private throughout his service. Years after the war ended, when he had returned to Japan and tried to rebuild a life in a country that barely resembled the one he had left, he gave occasional interviews to historians studying the Pacific War. In one of these interviews, conducted in the 1960s when he was in his 40s, he was asked what he remembered most clearly from his years of fighting. He paused for a long time before answering, his eyes focused on something distant that only he could see. "We thought Americans were soft," he finally said, his voice quiet and tinged with something that might have been bitterness or might have been simple exhaustion. "We were told they loved comfort and would not endure hardship. We were told our spirit made us superior. But their guns never rested, and that was the end of us." He said nothing more after that, and the interviewer did not press him. What else was there to say? The industrial might of America, expressed through machine guns that never seemed to stop firing, had met the spiritual determination of Japan, and matter had proven stronger than spirit. That was the fundamental lesson of the Pacific War, learned at terrible cost by men on both sides, but most terribly by those like Watanabe who had believed otherwise and survived to see how wrong they had been.